Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the 2005 Schroeder Lecture. My name is Max Melman, and I'm the director of the Law Medicine Center, which hosts the lectureship on an annual or semi-annual basis. The lecture was named in honor of Oliver C. Schroeder, who founded the Law Medicine Center in 1953, making it by far the oldest program in health law in the United States. And when he retired as the director of the Law Medicine Center, an endowment fund was created in his honor, and its mission is to invite to the law school an individual who is a distinguished individual who plays an exceptional role in the fields of healthcare law, and health policy. This year's recipient is Sidney Wolfe. In 1978, I served as outside science counsel to a major soft drink manufacturer that was trying to keep the world safe for diet pop in the face of efforts by the FDA to have saccharin banned as a carcinogen. And as I struggled to understand such arcana as mice bladder microcalculi and the Mantel-Bryan model for extrapolating animal toxicology to humans, I kept hearing about a boogeyman. The boogeyman was named Sidney Wolfe, and he was my client's principal nemesis. A few years earlier, Dr. Wolfe and Ralph Nader had created an organization called the Health Research Group, and Dr. Wolfe had proceeded to zero in on unsafe drugs and, in the case of saccharin, food additives. Dr. Wolfe was well prepared for this role, having graduated with a Bachelor of Science degree in chemistry and an MD from Case, and after interning at Metro had worked at the NIH as a senior staff fellow at the National Institute of Arthritis and Metabolic Diseases. By the time I first met him, he had already enjoyed considerable success in his campaign against unsafe drugs, having forced Abbott Labs to recall a line of contaminated IV products. I met Dr. Wolfe in 1978 in a parking lot outside what was then the Department of Health Education and Welfare, where he lambasted me about the perils of artificial sweeteners. And I came away from our first meeting with one overriding impression of his personality, and that was impassioned. Dr. Wolfe's passion has kept him going strong ever since. He has targeted the FDA for being in bed with the drug industry, criticized state medical boards for failing to discipline incompetent physicians, and taken aim at ephedra and other dietary supplements. He has become the foremost opponent of unsafe drugs and a tireless critic of lax government regulation. Along the way, he picked up a MacArthur Fellowship in 1990 and wrote a book entitled Worst Pills, Best Pills, the fourth edition of which has just come out, and which provides the title for today's lecture. So please join me in welcoming our Schroeder scholar, Dr. Sidney Wolfe.
It's nice to be back here. I'm also from Cleveland, aside from my connections with this place. I still intermittently teach at the medical school. I'm an adjunct professor in the Department of Internal Medicine. Tonight I'm going to talk, well, that's because the mic wasn't, can you hear me now? Yes? No? Can you hear me now? Yes. Okay, I'll just ship this over here, and I'll try and stay right here where you all can hear. Tonight I'm going to really focus on our book, but more importantly, the principles in it that will hopefully be useful to some of you in terms of your own health or the health of your children or parents or whatever else. We originally put this book out in 1988 because, having written articles and done a certain amount of work concerning prescription drug dangers, it seemed that there was a need for a book that really called the shots where they should be. And so we titled the book Worst Pills, Best Pills. Originally, the book listed about 100 or so drugs that were worst pills, and for everyone we listed the safer alternatives. It's now greatly expanded. The book is, I suppose, could be construed as an upper body workout because it weighs about 4 pounds or so. And I gave a talk on the book, somewhat like tonight's, at the YMHA in Manhattan last night, and several people, Barnes & Noble, independent of me, was apparently set up this little place to sell the books, and several people went up and they said, I'd like to buy the book, but I don't want to carry it home. So it was recommended that they go to their nearby Barnes & Noble store. But it is at once a guide to dangerous drugs and also an upper body workout, one arm at a time, or both arms. Why are we concerned about this problem? Average drug reactions, based on these numbers I'll show you, and these are all from published studies, and if anything, they're probably significantly larger now than they were at the time. 2 million serious adverse drug reactions yearly, just in this country. 100,000 deaths, adverse drug reaction deaths, and I will repeat this over and over again, mostly preventable. And depending on what year it is between the 4th and the 6th leading cause of death in the United States, greatly exceeding automobile accidents, HIV, and other things that people think are more common. And economically, it accounts for about $136 billion. Again, these figures are several years old, so it's more than that by now. And to the extent that it's preventable deaths, preventable hospitalizations, about 1.5 million people are hospitalized every year because of an adverse drug reaction, something should be done about it. And the purpose of the book, in parallel with our efforts to get the FDA to do things, is to try and do something about it. So in addition to the 1.5 million people I mentioned who are hospitalized because of adverse drug reactions every year, another 750,000 people who were fine when they came in the hospital for whatever reason develop in the hospital an adverse drug reaction. So the toll just is enormous in terms of adverse effects on the public health. Emergency room visits. This is a recent review of all the studies asking the question, how often does someone who goes in the emergency room go there because of an adverse drug reaction? And this review found out that 28% of all emergency department visits were drug-related, including a large proportion due to adverse drug reactions and inappropriate prescriptions. And again, the point was 70% were preventable. When we first put out our book, Worst Pills, Best Pills, it simulated some people to come up with lists of drugs that really shouldn't be used. They came up with lists that were much shorter than ours because they wanted to be absolutely clear, although we think ours are more than clear enough. And some of these people have looked at national data and asked the question, how many people nationally are taking one of these inappropriate or potentially inappropriate drugs? And in a fairly recent study, 6.6 million people a year were taking a potentially inappropriate drug. Now, this is of a much smaller list. It's probably 20 or 30 drugs instead of the now 181 that we list in our book as do not use. So overall, of the 181 drugs that we list in our book as do not use, 53 or 29% are amongst the top selling 200 drugs. This is based on retail prescriptions filled in 2004, I believe, for the latest data. And these drugs cost $22.2 billion. Again, emphasize for everyone that's a do not use, you can turn to page 350 and see one which is safer, often an older drug. This is just a very small example of some of the do not use drugs. Sleeping pills like Valium, Restoral, Ativan, Tranxene, antidepressants such as Surzone and Elavil, painkillers. Vioxx would be on the list, except it's off the market. We warned people to stop using Vioxx 4.5 years ago when it was clear from a well-done study funded by Merck that it was causing a 4-fold increased risk in heart attacks. Darvocet, basically worthless painkillers, addicting and cause cardiac toxicity. The toenail fungus drug Lamisil. Many of you have seen cartoons about little fungus things crawling around people's toenails, making your toenails look ugly, which is a cosmetic problem, to be sure, but the drug causes severe and often fatal liver toxicity. Rarely, but there are dozens, if not by now hundreds of cases of liver toxicity, and to trade off a cosmetic advantage for your toenails for liver toxicity we don't think is a good idea. So it is listed as a do not use drug. Other do not use drugs, a drug we tried to keep off the market, we didn't succeed in it, but since it's been on the market we have been attempting to get it taken off the market, and I think eventually it will come off the market, is Crestor, the newest of the cholesterol-lowering drugs. Others in this category of heart drugs are Lopid, Catapres, and so forth. Gastrointestinal drugs, Donatol, Librax. diabetes drugs, several of those, birth control pills, and just last week, another birth control device, this is a patch, has come under scrutiny. We actually warned people to stop using it a couple of years ago. It gives a much higher dose of estrogen and causes a higher rate of blood clots than the older pills. These three also contain an ingredient, not the estrogen, but the progestogen content of the pill, which causes increased blood clots. So we say don't use those. So the list that I just showed you, just 30 drugs on those last two slides, are 228 million prescriptions a year, cost of over $12 billion a year. And what the rest of this points out is that in many of the most commonly prescribed categories of drugs, mind drugs, which are tranquilizers, sleeping pills, antipsychotic drugs, heart drugs, gastrointestinal drugs, pain, arthritis drugs, large proportions of them, respectively 43%, 20%, 31%, and 37%, are on our do not use list. This is a study that we published in the Journal of the American Medical Association about 3 years ago. And here was the question we were asking. What happens on the average to a drug once it comes on the market? So we looked at every new drug approved by the FDA between 1975 and 1999. There were 548 such drugs. And we found that of them, 56, by the time that we did this study, which was data as of about 2000, 2001, 56 had either been taken off the market or were the subject of a black box warning. And by doing what is called a Kaplan-Meier analysis, which is a statistical test which looks at drugs that, for instance, were approved in 1978 or 79 who obviously couldn't have gone through a 25-year period, and projecting what might have happened to them based on the drugs that had been on for 25 years, we concluded that 1 out of 5 drugs were either withdrawn or required a new black box warning. And most of this was in the first 7 years. And so our conclusion from this and from other work is to recommend that nobody use any new drug unless it's a breakthrough drug, of which there are some, but not very many. Don't use any new drug until it's been on the market for 7 years, because that's the time where most of the surprises are going to happen. And unless you want to be part of a surprise, we urge you and physicians who take care of you to stay away from these drugs. This now gets in the area of something that we focused on heavily when we first did this book and continue to focus on it heavily, which is the often confusing to the physician and patient issue of drug-induced disease. You get to be 60, 70, and you start losing your memory, or you start developing Parkinson's disease, or you start having other problems, falling down, having hip fractures. And the tendency is to say, well, too bad, you're getting old. That's just part of growing old. These are all examples, well documented. We went over the records of them, of people who had not just age-related things, but had adverse drug reactions. Arrhythmia, causing a death of someone. Parkinsonism in someone who really started having Parkinsonism after a drug that caused Parkinsonism was prescribed, and only after a wise neurologist discovered this did they stop getting treated for their Parkinsonism with an anti-Parkinsonism drug, and were they taken off the drug that was causing it. Memory loss. The person who wrote the preface to our book, which I'll show you at the end, is a physician at the University of Washington, Seattle, who discovered 2 things in the way of drug-induced disease. One was reversible memory loss. A huge number of drugs, and I'll show you some of them, can cause memory loss. And if you're 60 or 70 and you start losing your memory, you say, well, it looks like it's early Alzheimer's or something, and often it is, but often it is a drug problem, and fortunately those are all reversible. He also discovered the relationship between using certain drugs and having falls and hip fractures. So these are examples, case examples, well documented, of drug-induced disease. So just focusing on this, and more broadly this issue of 100,000 deaths and 2 million serious adverse drug reactions, what do we do about it? And so the next few slides are going to look at this variety of drug-induced illnesses, which, to the extent that they could be reversed entirely or largely by reducing the dose of the drug or switching to another drug, and to the extent that too often the adverse drug reaction, which appears to be a disease, is treated with another drug, something should be done about it. When we first did our book in 1988, a woman was referred to me who was about 50, and she had low thyroid levels, documented low thyroid levels, and so she was appropriately put on thyroid medicine to treat the low thyroid levels. She was put on, as it turned out, too high a dose, and for some reason she was taking it very late in the day. And as a result of this, she developed insomnia. And because of this, she was put on a sleeping pill. And because she was put on a sleeping pill, she became depressed. Sleeping pills not infrequently can cause depression. And because of that, she was put on an antidepressant to treat the depression that was caused by the sleeping pill, the need for which was caused by the way she was taking her thyroid medicine. So we arranged with her physician to lower the dose of thyroid medicine and to take it early in the morning instead of late in the day. She stopped having insomnia. She stopped needing the sleeping pill. She stopped needing the antidepressant to treat the depression caused by the sleeping pill. So this is an example of sort of a cascade of drug-induced diseases being treated with drugs instead of prevention. These are examples. 166 drugs that can cause depression. You see some of them there. 156 drugs that can cause hallucinations or psychosis. Sexual dysfunction, an interesting issue. A year after Viagra came on the market, I looked through FDA's files, legally, with permission, to look at all of the cases of adverse reactions that have been reported with Viagra. I was more interested in what other drugs these people were taking than in the actual nature of the adverse reactions. And what I found was that half of the people who had had an adverse reaction to Viagra were taking one or more drugs that can cause sexual dysfunction. Now, whereas this is obviously in men, many of these same drugs, the SSRIs, Prozac, Zoloft, and so forth, can also cause sexual dysfunction in women. But again, if the sexual dysfunction is drug-induced, the treatment might be changing the drug, lowering the dose, as opposed to taking Viagra or Levitra or Cialis to treat what is drug-induced sexual dysfunction. I mentioned our friend Eric Larson, whose quote I'll show you at the end of this talk, discovering well-documented reversible dementia in older people particularly, and these are just some of the drugs that can cause this. Hip fractures and falling, another category. Auto accidents, falling asleep, and so forth. Insomnia. I mentioned Synthroid, which is the brand name of thyroid, or one of the brand names, and these are other drugs that can also cause insomnia. Again, most of the people taking these drugs who have insomnia are given sleeping pills, even though there should be other ways of dealing with this. Drug-induced Parkinsonism. We have to get rid of this thing here. Can we get rid of this little intrusion here? Fine. We've done that. So we now go into, this is not meant to be a religious treatise, deadly sins, but this is meant to just categorize areas of problems where prescriptions are written where they shouldn't be or where it's the wrong prescription. First, the disease for which the drug is prescribed is actually an adverse reaction to another drug. We've just given some examples masquerading as a disease. Second, the drug is used to treat a problem that, although susceptible to prescription drug or over-the-counter drug solution, should first be treated with common sense lifestyle changes. A huge proportion of people with mild hypertension, with mild adult onset diabetes, with mild obesity or being overweight, should first be tried with lifestyle changes. Unfortunately, too many physicians have not been adequately trained in nutrition and other kinds of things, and it's much easier to just write a prescription, particularly when someone has been yelling in your ear, a drug salesperson, that that's the way to take care of these problems. Third, medical problem is both self-limited and completely unresponsive to treatments. such as antibiotics, such as the use of antibiotics for viral infections for which no antibiotic will work at all. Antibacterials certainly will not work. A lot of self-limited diseases, a cold being a good example, will get better in 7 days with certain drugs and a week without certain drugs. And the net impact of the certain drugs is often certain adverse reactions, including insomnia, because some of these have an upper, a decongestant, which is an upper. We've argued for 25 years no one should ever take a systemic decongestant because you're getting roughly 25 times more drug than if you squirted some spray in your nose, and with all the dangers of them inherent. I mean, PPA, or phenylpropanolamine, which was an ingredient in a lot of cold preparations, was taken off the market after it was shown to cause hemorrhagic stroke. It's an upper and increases blood pressure and stroke. 4, drug is the preferred treatment, but instead of giving you a safer alternative, one of the 181 do-not-use drugs is recommended. So obviously, and it's not just self-serving, just stay away from do-not-use drugs. There are safer alternatives. 5th, drugs interact. Most people, including many physicians, have a misperception as to what a drug interaction means. It does not mean that if you put the two drugs together, an explosion occurs. What it does mean is that one drug will stop the body from efficiently getting rid of the other drug. So if you take two drugs that interact, the first one may inhibit the liver's ability to get rid of the second drug, and therefore you may accumulate dangerous levels of the second drug, not because you were prescribed dangerous levels, but because the body couldn't effectively get rid of it. Another problem are physicians who sometimes it's necessary, but more often it is not, will prescribe two drugs in the same therapeutic category. And the second one, either based on clinical studies, doesn't have any evidence of increasing the effectiveness of the first one, but prefers another risk. 2 risks, 1 benefit. Not a good deal. 7, right drug is prescribed, dose is too high. It's particularly true in older adults, and we'll go through some reasons why older adults have more difficulty with prescription drugs and why they should always be started in probably 98% of cases with a lower dose. And older adult includes me, has included me for 20-some years, because some of these changes in the liver and kidney start at age 40 or 50. So these are 9 reasons why older adults, and all of these things are, again, in the book, so you don't need to write them down. Smaller bodies, different body composition. When we get older, our weight generally goes down. It may seem to go in the other direction for a while, but we have a smaller amount of water. To the extent that a lot of the drugs are water soluble, the same amount of drug will be dissolved in a smaller amount of water, and therefore the concentration will be higher. For example, decreased ability of the liver to process drugs and the kidney to get drugs out of the body. The kidney one starts at age 35 to 40, and by the time we were 65, the filtering ability has decreased by 30%. These are not people with kidney disease or liver disease, just people who are aging, and these two organs that are so crucial to drug metabolism or elimination are not working as well. It gets obviously much worse if you also have kidney disease or liver disease. Increased sensitivity. Part of this is decreased body size, the problem with less water, higher concentrations. But even at normal blood levels, the last part of this, older people may be much more sensitive to drugs than younger people are. How many of you, average age, how many of you over 60? I'm not asking you how many of you are over 60. Here's the question. How many of you who are over 60, when you get out of bed in the morning, sit on the edge of your bed for at least 10 seconds before standing? Okay, 4 or 5. Why is this important? When we are younger and we get out of bed, the blood tends to rush to the bottom of our body just by gravity, but instantly our more effective, younger homeostatic mechanisms constrict the blood vessels, and it happens so quickly that the blood pressure is not allowed to fall. This does not work as well when we're older. So either when you're standing from, or when you're getting out of bed, you should sit on the edge of the bed, or when you're standing, having been sitting, stand by the chair for, again, 5 or 10 seconds. This is a major cause of falls, and it's completely avoidable. Compounding this, though, are people who are taking blood pressure medicine. So that in addition to not being able to compensate for the gravitational effect, you are taking a drug which may lower your blood pressure. And so, again, even more important, although even if you're not taking high blood pressure drugs, it's important to do this. Decreased temperature compensation. As human beings, this is one of the first things I did when I arrived at NIH in '66 was to study how much water you had to drink to avoid going into negative fluid balance when it was warm outside. And it's amazing how much sweat you can produce when it's hot. Humans would die if they didn't sweat, period. The only way we stay alive in a hot environment, other than air conditioning, is to sweat. It evaporates and it cools the body. Normally, if it's very, very hot outside, we are able to divert almost all of our fluid to sweat and thereby help us stay in good health. Certain drugs that people take interrupt this diversion of fluid into sweat and force a certain amount of fluid to go into the urine. Diuretics, that's what they do. So that when it gets very hot outside, it's all the more important to pay attention to drugs you're taking that might cause fluid loss, to drink more liquid, and so forth. So there's another interaction between drugs and just generally the decreased temperature withstanding abilities when one is older. More diseases that affect the response to drugs. I mentioned earlier that even if you don't have liver or kidney disease, those functions decrease with age, but if you do, it makes it even more difficult to figure out the right dose of the drug and makes it even more necessary to use lower doses. More drugs, more adverse reactions. Obviously, if you're taking one drug, you can't have an adverse interaction. If you take 2, it goes up 3, 4, 5. Many older people are taking 6, 7, 8 drugs. I am happy to report, she would not attack me for saying this, that my 97-year-old mother is taking 1 prescription drug, and she is in very good health and somehow has survived without taking a large number of prescription drugs. The point is that once you start, I mean, and obviously many people need to take more than 1 drug, but as you go up in number, you multiply the possibility for interactions. It's a geometric, not an arithmetic increase in possible interactions. This is a favorite quote of mine. Peter Lamy, who was at the University of Maryland School of Pharmacy, who died about 15 years ago, his most famous line, which I and I think other people appropriately quote, about the problem of the fact that older people who take the most drugs are often the least used subjects for finding out about these drugs. So what Peter said was, we test drugs in young people for 3 months, we give them to old people for 15 years. And for the reasons I point out in the last few slides, old people and young people are very different in many respects. Rules for safer drug use. This you all have heard of, but I'm not sure how many of you have done it, and it is done completely. People are taking not only prescription drugs, but they're also taking over-the-counter drugs, and an increasing number of people, unfortunately, are taking dietary supplements. One of the chapters we added to this book, which hadn't been in there previously, was a review of 13 of the biggest selling dietary supplements, finding that none of them really would pass the test of being effective and safe if they had to pass that test because of a law which Congress passed. They don't have to be shown to be safe, effective. The companies don't have to report deaths or any adverse reactions. But people who take these on their own, as is the case for over-the-counter drugs, often are embarrassed to tell or don't tell their physician. So the first rule is to let your physician, and hopefully it's a primary care physician, which is what Rule 10 is, know everything that you're using, because the odds are that they may say, wait a minute, this interacts with this, you probably shouldn't be using one of them, and the most dispensable one will be dispensed with. Make sure drug therapy is really needed. This is a corollary of what I said earlier, that a lot of times problems that either are self-limited or problems that could benefit from non-pharmacologic solutions are immediately treated with drugs. 3, start with a lower dose and go slowly up. much safer than starting with a higher dose and getting an unnecessary adverse reaction. Many people are taking 5, 6, 7 drugs, and the most dispensable of those should be the one that maybe is stopped if it is really necessary to take another drug that really is critical. Stopping a drug is important to starting it. Many people who have been taking an antihypertensive drug for several years, for reasons we don't fully understand, their need decreases. And so periodically attempting with the physician to lower the dose of an antihypertensive drug and see, which will be the case many times, that the blood pressure still stays the same, and when you lower it down to nothing, it may still stay the same. It's not something you should do on your own, but a way of, again, reducing exposure to drugs. Find out if you're having any adverse drug reactions. Studies 35 years ago and recently still show that many physicians, a majority, do not adequately inform people about known risks of prescription drugs, which means that when the person takes the drug and develops what is in fact an adverse drug reaction, they think, well, maybe this is just a turn for the worse of my disease, and they don't make the connection and therefore don't call the physician and therefore have a longer period of adverse drug reactions than they should. Rule 7 is probably as important as any, which is once you start taking a new drug and you develop a new symptom, the default should be this is an adverse drug reaction until proven otherwise. If you have books or information that points this out, fine. Otherwise, tell your physician about it, because this may be the beginning of what is a serious adverse reaction, and you and your physician maybe should lower the dose or switch away from that drug. Particularly true for older people, but even for some younger people, before leaving the doctor's office, make sure how to take the medicine, the issue of adverse reactions are clear to you and a family member or friend. 9, there's actually it's not funny, but it is at some level amusing article on the front page of the New York Times this morning after we made this rule, which is 17 years old. Discard all drugs carefully. The article in the Times is about people who they get prescribed these drugs and they have friends who, oh yeah, you have this problem, why don't you, we'll give you this drug, and there's this whole circle of trading drugs. This is dangerous because someone may not have the disease that the amateur physician thinks that they have and may have a very bad reaction to the drug. Someone may be taking another drug unbeknownst to the drug hander-outer. So discard all old drugs carefully is a good rule. And then finally, as I mentioned before, everyone needs to have a primary care doctor. This is not self-serving because I am a primary care general internist, but because too often older people wind up going to the kidney doctor, the heart doctor, the gastrointestinal doctor, the neurologist, and no one is coordinating the care, leading people to get prescriptions for drugs that, if one person knew about it, would never all be prescribed, and so forth. Saving money when buying prescriptions. There's a much longer list of this, such as pill splitting, which, given that older people can do with lower doses, is something that should be tried, reduces both the cost of a drug and also the chance of having an adverse reaction, and may well be that you are way above the amount you need to get the effect, and taking half as much may do it. So 5 rules beyond that: if appropriate, ask for a non-drug treatment. These are obviously overlapping with these other lists. Avoid, do not use drugs. Over the years, many of the drugs that we've said do not use have been taken off the market. You'll see a list of a small number of them. As I mentioned before, because of the study we did and because of other evidence, don't use new drugs unless they are a breakthrough drug for at least 7 years. By then, by definition, they'll be safer if they're still in the market, and at least you will know about, through a black box warning, some of the newly discovered problems. Buy generic drugs. There is no evidence whatsoever that generic drugs are any less effective or safe than brand name drugs. More and more expensive brand name drugs are coming off patent. You should use generic drugs. Finally, we think that purchasing drugs from Canada, importing them, or using internet purchase can be very good, but you have to be very, very careful. There are a lot of charlatans in this country who have websites where you don't need to have a doctor, and there is only a computer version of a pharmacist that actually does the prescribing and dispensing. And unfortunately, the medical boards and pharmacy boards have not dealt with some of the people that are lending their names to these websites as much as they should. This is just a summary of the relatively few times in 34 years we've asked the FDA to ban 27 prescription drugs. 2/3 of them, or 18, are off the market now. Another 4, the use is severely limited, and 5 of them, or almost 20%, are still in the market. It's mainly recently approved drugs like Celebrex and Crestor. We tried the FDA to get the FDA to ban Celebrex. At the same time, we tried to get them to ban Bextra. They have left Celebrex in the market. I think that is a mistake because it has increased cardiovascular risks as well. This is only partly funny. The part that isn't funny is that this year, through an act of Congress that was passed 13 years ago called the Prescription Drug User Fee Act, the FDA gets $200 million in cash directly from the drug industry to fund a good chunk of its review functions. And those who say it doesn't have any influence on the FDA to get funded from the industry it's supposed to regulate are wrong. There are lots of people, physicians and others in the FDA, who are starting to think that their client is not the public entirely, which is what it should be, but it's also the industry. And the behavior since this law was passed, accompanied by decreased congressional oversight, has led the FDA to be far less vigilant than it used to be in the 70s and 80s when I first started doing this work. This is a little bit on advertising. This is a book. It's a wonderful short book, which I got a used version from, I guess, barnesandnoble.com or one of those things, called The Garden of Folly. The folly is advertising. And a Canadian economist, Stephen Leacock, wrote this book 81 years ago. And this is really the most poignant description of what advertising is I've ever seen. The science of arresting the human intelligence long enough to get money from it. And it's not just direct-to-consumer advertising to patients. It is the advertising and promotion of drugs to physicians with as much misleading information as the companies can get away with. And this next chart shows what the companies can get away with. These bars, one for each year, represent the number of times the FDA stopped an illegal prescription drug ad. And what this takes the form of is a letter from FDA to the company saying, your ad for Vioxx or whatever is illegal, stop it right away. It is overstating the benefits, it's understating the risk, it doesn't have an adequate balance between benefits and risk. And what you can see is in 1998, at the peak of FDA's activity in this area, they stopped 157 illegal prescription drug ads. The amount of drug ads has rocketed since then. So if the ads were no better, no worse than they were in 98, one would expect a big increase in the number of enforcement actions. But what you can see is that during the Clinton administration, this started rocketing down significantly to the point where last year it was down to 23, an 85 or 86% decrease in the amount of activity that the FDA is exerting through the law and regulations that it's supposed to be upholding. And the message to the industry is, we can just mislead people. And of course, a misleading ad may result in a dead patient, because if a physician prescribes a drug based on thinking the drug is safer and or more effective than it really is, the doctor may write a prescription for something they wouldn't have written for if they had been adequately informed. So advertising enforcement is very, very important. And this, finally, as I mentioned to you, this is the guy who discovered the link between drug-induced dementia and drug-induced falls and hip fractures, and he wrote the preface to our book, and he read the whole book. He actually was our original, back 17 years ago, he was the original person that we sent all the do-not-use drugs to, and we said, do you agree with all these? And he agreed with all but one, and the drug was no more worthless than all the other drugs for Alzheimer's disease, called Hydrogene. We thought it should be do not use. He didn't. And about a year after this, we actually published in the 1988 version, Hydrogene should be do not use. A study funded by the company that made Hydrogene showed that it was no better than a sugar pill and actually could have worsened cognitive functions. But what Eric said was, correctly, that we are appropriately harsh. We are not inappropriately harsh, that one should not be hopeless or cynical. One should use the information to tell the difference between the best pills or the safer, equally or more effective pills, and the ones that you should stay away from. This is just, as I mentioned before, a list. It's not complete because a couple more drugs have come off the market since this list was made. This is when we warned, the right-hand column, Worst Pills, Best Pills News is the monthly newsletter that updates people who have the drug, the book, or don't have the book with what we're doing. It's now available on a website, which I think I have the URL on the last slide. So the right-hand column is when we told people stop using Vioxx or Baycol or whatever, and the middle column is when, often 2, 3, or more years later, the FDA actually took it off the market. We were not guessing. We were basing our conclusions on data, often unpublished data, that we got from the FDA, sometimes having to sue them to force some of these company studies to be released. And so over and over again, we have predicted, I think usefully for people that get this information, the dangers of a drug before we have, through the other part of our work, gotten the FDA to ban them. This is the website. And I will stop on that note and be glad to try and answer questions you have on either what I've talked about or other things that you think correctly or incorrectly that I might know something about. Yes. And tell me who you are.
I would like to know if you have an opinion about holistic medicine and medications subscribed by holistic experts.
The question is my opinion about holistic medicine. Holistic medicine, one way of looking at it is going to a doctor who looks at your whole person rather than just your kidney or your heart or whatever else. And this is the way medicine should be practiced. But the next way, which is I think implied by your question, is what about non-traditional alternative kinds of things? And let us include in that dietary supplements, large doses of vitamins, acupuncture, hypnosis, meditation. All of them should be judged on their own merits. If they work and they are relatively safe compared with what they're being used to treat, fine. The problem is that many of them have, through pressure from the industries, in the case of dietary supplements, managed to escape any kind of surveillance. So we don't really know the answers to the questions for instance, dietary supplements, about whether they are effective at all. And the more we learn, the more dangers we learn about them. St. John's wort, for instance, interacts with about 50 different drugs. And if you're taking one of those drugs and your doctor may not know you're taking St. John's wort, you can get into serious trouble. The fact that it doesn't work at all or only works for mild kinds of depression is interesting, but it has not had to go through the hurdles of proof that it's safe and effective. Acupuncture, the traditional uses of it are to treat every disease known, and there really is essentially no evidence that it works for that. On the other hand, there is good evidence, I believe, some people disagree, that for pain-related syndromes that it may be effective. And if it's done safely by someone who knows what they're doing and it's confined to those areas where there's some evidence, it's fine. So I think that, again, the two-part answer to your question is you should be going to a physician who does consider all aspects of your life, not just 1 or 2 or 3 organs, but your situation you're going through in terms of your job or home and everything else. I mean, psychophysiologic, formerly called psychosomatic medicine, is a very powerful thing, which means that stress and things like this can have effect on various organ systems and so forth. And if you just treat the symptoms and don't go back to the causes, which someone who is an organ-based as opposed to an overall doctor will do, it's not a good idea. And I just think that the more evaluation, careful, methodic evaluation of these alternative treatments there are, the better. Some of them may turn out to be fine. They may turn out to work and be relatively safe. Fine, but the first ones that have gone through these hurdles in most cases have turned out not to be effective, and people need to know that. There is some belated turnaround of the sales of a lot of these things. The only dietary supplement we've ever been involved with in terms of regulatory action was ephedra. We petitioned the FDA in September of 2001 to ban ephedra after it had caused a large number of deaths, after it was banned. It was banned in the military on PXs because 30-some soldiers died, soldiers who had passed all their physicals, died shortly after taking this drug, this slip of the tongue, this dietary supplement. If you sell dietary supplements, you pretend that they're foods, and so the people selling ephedra say, you should have two courses of this, or 2 helpings, or 2 servings, was the phrase they used, of this every day, not 2 doses or 2 pills or whatever else. So that's sort of a long answer to your question, but those are my views. Yes?
Madeline Hall, in your book you said hormone replacement therapy was an experiment that failed. And I wonder if you feel the same way about the bisphosphonates such as Fosamax, Actonil, Evistra.
Yeah.
Are they really just failures?
The question was, we've said in our book, and we actually have been saying for 25 years, stay away from hormone replacement therapy, except for the briefest period of time, if absolutely necessary, to treat hot flashes and acute symptoms of the menopause. I think that it's probably safe to say that the dangers of hormone replacement therapy are considerably more than the dangers of bisphosphonates. The reason is that the hormones were known in animals and even in people long ago to cause various kinds of cancer, although they were prescribed for a while to prevent heart attacks and strokes. They actually cause heart attacks and strokes. There's a recent study a few weeks ago showing they may increase incontinence, although they were prescribed to decrease incontinence. It is a major disaster, and my guess is that in a few years we'll have the data showing that a big epidemic of breast cancer is now receding because the use of hormone replacement therapy is itself receding. There is no question they cause breast cancer and other kinds of cancer. The issue of the bisphosphonates, or the drugs to prevent or treat osteoporosis, is a little more complicated. They are much less effective than people have been led to believe they are. Women are being herded into clinics to have bone mineral density tests done, which for some people may make sense, but just do them regularly on everyone, and then people that are just a little bit off the average or out of the range being prescribed these drugs. These drugs do have some adverse effects. I do not think, at least thus far, they are known to be carcinogens, but I think they are grossly over-promoted, and my guess is in a while we will learn more about them. The one thing I'm very concerned with, based on one of the early ones, is that after taking them for 5 years, there's some evidence that the bone fragility may increase instead of decrease. And we've written about this in our newsletter and in the book, and more information is coming about on this topic. So I think that they're different, but similar in the sense they're grossly over-promoted, and probably a number of women who are really not at high risk for osteoporosis and hip fractures are being herded into using them. Another question. Yes, there. Your name, please, just,
Sorry?
tell me what your name is.
Oh, Van Stoll.
Hi, Van Stoll.
You're addressing the question of more is sometimes better. There's so much increase of staph infections in hospitals and in surgery. The case that I have in mind, the minocycline was suggested at a very high dosage for about 3 months, and the original doctor said, let this then taper off to a half or a quarter. However, in subsequent visits to doctors, the reaction has been, staph is a horrible infection. Let's not take any chances. Keep up at the original dosage, probably for the rest of your life.
Well,
Can you react to that at all?
well, the section, the section it has to do with, I guess, at some level, inappropriate use or use for too long or use for too high doses of antibiotics. I mean, there's no question that one of the reasons why there are more bacteria resistant to antibiotics is the indiscriminate use of antibiotics for a lot of conditions. A healthy adult who does not have lung disease or heart disease, who develops a cold and develops bronchitis, there is no evidence, zero evidence, that this person will have any benefit from taking an antibiotic. It is not the case for someone who has lung disease, is frail, elderly, and whatever else. And yet, one of the major areas of prescribing antibiotics is for bronchitis. There are now 2 randomized controlled studies where half the people got a placebo and half of them got an antibiotic for treating bronchitis, and it just doesn't make any difference other than A, it costs more, and B, you have the extra adverse reaction. So I think the issue you're raising, which is generally the indiscriminate use of antibiotics for too long or too high doses, is a big problem. And again, these drugs are heavily promoted. Antibiotics can be life-saving. Let's acknowledge that, re-acknowledge that. But the drug companies grossly over-promote these things. One company, Pfizer, despite guidelines coming from the government about what should be used for treating ear infections in kids, literally engaged in a heavily financed campaign designed to counter the federal guidelines because the federal guidelines didn't have their drug being sold very much. So there's a lot of premeditated and heavily financed misinformation coming from drug companies. Yes, back there.
Peter Weinberg. Dr. Wolfe, I'm interested in your opinion about the current trend in our Congress to immunize drug companies from liability in response to their claims that they are unwilling to invest in research and put new drugs on the market because of their fear of lawsuits.
Yeah, well, the question is, what do I think about the efforts in Congress fueled by the drug industry to immunize themselves from liability, and the excuse that's used, if you don't do this, we're not going to bring you miracle drugs. Let's start with the end of it, the bringing miracle drugs. Most of the drugs that come on the market are Me Too drugs. When you see a drug advertised, almost by definition, it's a drug that in fact is no better than another drug, but which, in order to sell, has to be advertised in some way to make it seem better. And of course, with FDA not enforcing the laws and regulations on misleading advertising, the companies can do that. The same kind of research blackmail is used when someone says, why, with the Medicare drug benefit that people started signing up with yesterday and will go into effect in a month and a half, didn't the government just do, as they've already done for the Defense Department and the VA, have price controls, negotiate prices? Every country in the world has them. We have them for the DOD and the VA, 10 million people, but for the 40 million of us who are Medicare eligible, we don't have it. And again, the industry succeeded with the number. They have more lobbyists in Washington from the drug industry than there are members of Congress. I mean, that's a fact. And what they succeeded in doing, and I will get to your question because it's the same problem, is convincing the Congress that there wouldn't be enough money for research if we had price controls here. There's no evidence for that. The profit margin in the industry is around 18%, which is about 1.5 times the profit margin of all other American industries. And so they're nowhere near the point where they could justifiably argue that they don't have enough money. The immunity, so the bill that goes into effect in a month and a half has a phrase in it, there will be no price controls. There will be no regulation of prices. And so you've got this bewildering, impossible to understand private sector competitive thing for Part D of Medicare, which most people can't understand. I was telling people before, I gave grand rounds in a New York hospital about a month ago, and there were about 100 physicians there. And I said, how many of you are Medicare eligible? And about 30 of them raised their hand. I said, how many of you understand the Medicare drug benefit? And one person raised their hand. And I wasn't sure after talking with them that he was telling me the truth. But on the immunity, there's a bill which passed Congress this year called H.R. 5. H.R. 5 appears to be just, which is bad enough, a cap on payouts for the most vulnerable people who have malpractice cases successfully concluded or settled. But at the back end of it is a provision that essentially says, if your drug has been approved by the FDA, you cannot be sued, period, for punitive damages at all, which would eliminate most of litigation against drug companies. It has been euphemistically called the Vioxx exemption, because the litigation that Merck, given how misleading it was and how much information it withheld about Vioxx, it is likely to have to pay out, would be reduced by 95% if this thing passed. It has already passed the House. It will probably, hopefully, not pass in the Senate. So, and again, just as they did with the Medicare drug benefit, they say, if we don't have this, which is what your question, Peter, was, we're not going to be able to do enough research. They're just, if they were doing exclusively research on really breakthrough drugs, which they aren't, it still wouldn't be valid. But given that the research is mainly not on breakthrough drugs, it's even less valid. So I am not very sympathetic with that. It is an important form, other than the traditional government regulation, of regulating the behavior of drug companies. Other questions? Max.
Arguably, one reason that doctors overprescribe, and perhaps the antibiotics for bronchitis might be an example, is that they're afraid of lawsuits, defensive medicine. I wonder if you have any comments on that.
I do. Someone known mutually to Max and to me, but he may not have known or thought about this when he asked the question. I have 4 daughters, and one of them, before she went to medical school here and became an internist and a teacher and whatnot, worked for 6 years for something called the Office of Technology Assessment, which was a research wing of the Congress, which did a lot of studies that congressional staff didn't have the facilities to do, but was eliminated because the industries whose products were often maligned by the reports of this didn't like it, so they just eliminated it entirely. But one of the reports that Leah Wolfe worked on was on defensive medicine. It was back 12 years ago, something like that, 14 years ago. And they really failed to come up with any convincing evidence that the defensive medicine problem was anywhere near as great or serious as it was claimed by people. If you're a physician and when you order a lab test for $20, you get $10 for reading the result, even though the result is already there in brackets and everything, it is much easier to say that you're doing that lab test because you don't want to be sued than it is to say you're doing this lab test because you make money off of it. So I think that the evidence for defensive medicine being anything other than a little slice, I mean, I'm not saying there isn't any defensive medicine, but the evidence for it being a significant contributor to health costs or anything else is just really non-existent. And since that study, which is what that study concluded, I don't think there's really been any new evidence. The evidence that's put forth by the AMA, for example, is based on surveys they do of physicians who, again, are much more likely, because of the use of this information, to answer that way than they are to honestly say, I'm doing it because I make money off of it or because I think it's good medicine. I mean, some of what is described as defensive medicine is actually practicing good medicine, doing things that you should have done anyway, whether or not you had a fear of litigation behind them. So anyway, I hope that answers your question, Max.
We have time for maybe one more question.
Ab.
Sidney, in your opinion, if aspirin were introduced as a new drug application now, would it get approved by the FDA, and if so, would it have a black box warning?
Well, aspirin would definitely get approved because the more we study it, particularly, for example, in people who are at high risk of heart attacks and stroke. I mean, the evidence in the last 5 or 10 years supports even more strongly the prophylactic use in such individuals of aspirin. Unlike other painkillers that increase the risk of heart attacks, this one actually decreases the risk of heart attacks. Whether it would have a black box warning or not, I don't know. A warning that if you start getting vomiting or nausea or black stools or coughing up, vomiting up blood or pain in your stomach, you should stop taking it might be appropriate because some people are sensitive to aspirin. most people are not sensitive to aspirin. So I think that whether it's aspirin or anything else, if it has a unique benefit, which aspirin clearly does, and it also has a risk, but a risk which you can warn about, I think that the remedy is to approve it and let people know about it. One more question. Yes.
I was wondering.
Your name, please?
Oh, okay. My name is Bernie. Okay.
Bernie. Just Bernie.
So,
That's good.
So it's like.
Hi, Bernie.
I was wondering, like, about aspartame.
Aspartame.
It's what they put in the salt.
Right.
And it seemed.
That's because Max screwed up on the saccharin thing. That's why.
I heard a report, okay, that if you drink aspartame in soft drinks, it can affect the brain in such a way that it can cause moving objects to appear to flutter.
So your question is what do I think about aspartame? Is that the question? Is that the question?
I mean, should it be banned?
Okay. Aspartame was carefully studied before it was approved in animals, and aspartame is a combination of two amino acids, aspartic acid and glutamic acid, and it is there in much higher quantities than we normally have of these naturally occurring substances in the body. And studies done at MIT before it was approved showed that it can clearly alter brain metabolism, so there was really no question of that. There are other studies, whether it's saccharin or aspartame or anything else, that show that which you confirm when you go into a restaurant and see someone eating a 3,000-calorie meal and having some aspartame with their coffee, a silly, at best, kind of thing. These things don't really work either to lose weight or to sustain weight loss. I mean, if you're doing other things, yes, those are fine. So, and there was also a question never fully resolved about whether aspartame was a carcinogen. We had some concerns about it. We did not try and keep it from coming on the market. After it came on the market, there were large numbers of reports, never thoroughly analyzed, of people who had never had a seizure in their life, taking aspartame on a hot day, drinking 5 or 10 cans of it. It doesn't say, don't drink more than 5 of me on the can or anything like that, and having seizures, and then stopping aspartame, never having seizures again. So the effect on the nervous system, I don't think there's much question about it. It just has not been methodically studied because, again, it is not a drug. It's a food additive, not a dietary supplement. It did have to go through certain hurdles, but the hurdles were mainly animal hurdles to make sure it wasn't clearly a carcinogen. I think it is not clearly a carcinogen at all. But I'm still concerned. I mean, I would never use any of these things at all. I'm still concerned about the fact that it does alter brain chemistry, and that may be the explanation for the seizures that don't have any other explanation in many people who've had them only when using large amounts of this stuff. Thank you for your good question.
Okay, thank you very much, Jim. Something for you. So this is the plaque to honor Dr. Wolfe as the 2005 Schroeder Scholar in Residence. Thank you very much for that excellent talk. On the way, just after I finished introducing him, he asked me, he said, do you still drink diet sodas? And I said, of course.
I rest
and
my case.
In connection with that, you are please invited upstairs to a reception with refreshments. They may indeed include diet drinks. And that's just up that way, so please join us, and thank you for coming.